A farm is shaped over time, much like the soil itself, built up by years of decisions, agreements, and assumptions that often go unquestioned. Most of the time, those layers sit quietly in the background, but when land is passed on, they suddenly matter. That's where agricultural property relief comes in. It's often spoken about as a single tax relief, but in reality, it depends on how land is used, is owned, and structured, sometimes in ways families don't expect. What's at stake isn't just a number on a balance sheet, but the continuity of the farm and the choices available to the next generation. In this episode, we'll explore what APR really covers, where uncertainty arises, and how it shapes long-term planning. To help us unpack these issues, I'm joined by Tom Lawson, Portfolio Manager at W1M Wealth Investment Management, whose grounded approach helps families protect their assets and those use tools like trusts to support long-term stewardship. So Tom, when people talk about agricultural property relief, what does it actually cover in practice, and how do the different parts of the farm fit into that picture?
Thanks, Paul. So primarily agricultural property relief kind of covers what it says on the tin. So it's what you'd expect in terms of land and farm buildings. However, in a farming context, we can also start to bring in business property relief, which works in a similar way. And that relief covers machinery, livestock, and then other diversification such as farm shops and holiday lets. So it's really that combination of APR and BPR that we're talking about here. The latest plans from the government introduce from April 2026 a cap on the value of those assets which are free from inheritance tax. And so after some recent changes, that cap will be now £2.5 million per individual, and that can also be moved between spouses. So really for a normal family farm, assets up to £5 million will be free from inheritance tax. Any assets above that limit will be charged an effective rate of 20% inheritance tax rather than the normal 40%.
So how does APR shape succession planning, particularly when families are thinking about the long-term continuity of the farm?
So it's an interesting one, really. I mean, it's a strange situation in that previously, because these assets have been free from inheritance tax, they could be passed between generations without a huge amount of extensive planning. They would just pass on to the next generation upon death. One thing which is quite interesting in this situation is that typically when you're thinking about inheritance planning, kids aren't that interested in living in their parents' house. Whereas now with farms, they are treasured assets that need to realistically be kept together in order to have the legacy. You can't carve up a farm and expect it to kind of continue as it is. So in terms of starting to think about it for the long-term continuity, it's really important now to establish the overall size of the estate, to see whether it might be impacted by these new rules, and then also start to think about accelerating any financial planning. And there are options available. The best time to start planning is now. And those available options could be things like gifting, trusts, life insurance, and ultimately the aim of a planning exercise would be to try and potentially reduce the size of an estate in a sensible way to minimise any impact of inheritance tax above that threshold.
And at a broader level, how big is the APR challenge for farming families today? And at what points does it usually come into focus?
Yeah, it's a big challenge. I mean, things have improved. There's been a lot of lobbying over the last year, and we've moved from a situation where it was looking pretty scary to a point where, okay, it's better. However, clearly, it still poses a challenge for these businesses and farms that are valued over £5 million. A very quick and dirty example is if you imagine a farming business worth 7 million, that could generate an inheritance tax bill of about £400,000. Now, this can be paid off over 10 years at the moment, interest free, but that's still generating £40,000 a year in tax from an industry where cash, honestly, is often tight.
Yeah.
I think what makes that even more challenging is that because it hasn't been a consideration until recently, we haven't had to think about this for the last 30 years, even more. Many of these farms remain owned by that older generation because they haven't needed to think about it. And that starts to limit the opportunities for gifting, as we mentioned, because any gifts that are made out of an estate, they're only free from inheritance tax after 7 years. And so, unfortunately, kind of hearing about this late and it being implemented so quickly still presents some challenges.
So if a family wants to approach APR with confidence, where's the most useful place to start before getting into detailed planning?
So I think the silver lining really in all this is that there are options and there are tools that can be used to help. The best place to start really is making sure that you've got a really firm grip on the ownership and the structure of the ownership of the farm. It sounds a bit simple, but over time and over generations, this has often got quite complicated. You could have ownership split across different generations between siblings who might not be, some of them might not be involved in running the day-to-day business. You could have corporations, you could have farming, businesses as well as individual ownership. There could be trusts involved. So it's very easy to kind of see an example where it gets quite messy. I think understanding in detail who owns what at the very beginning will, one, help to establish the size of each pot and the size of the estates for each individual, and also ultimately who might be liable for paying a bill. It's all very well receiving a gift from someone's estate or receiving sort of something out of probate and then not being able to pay the tax bill for it. I think, secondly, and related to that, it's also important just to triple check which assets qualify for which relief, and just confirming that what you expected to be able to have outside of your or for qualifying assets actually will do. And really starting with that solid understanding is going to help the subsequent conversations.
Yeah. And from your experience, what do farming families most overlook on APR, and how do those blind spots tend to show up over time?
So I think, kind of related really to that first point, the biggest risk at the moment is thinking this is going to go away. There's been a lot of work to try and lessen the impact, but the government seems pretty determined at this point to try and implement this. And I think really the mindset of planning for the worst whilst hoping for the best, I think would be most prudent. And really, I think where this gets really important, and I think where the risk is, and where people kind of need to kind of, I think, start making some progress, is the conversations. And often these conversations are on quite a human level, and they can be very difficult with family dynamics and potentially changing ownership, and who's going to be involved, who doesn't want to be involved, and so you can imagine these situations that go far beyond simply a kind of financial planning exercise. And so I think the biggest kind of challenge or overlooking something would be avoiding having a tricky conversation, because as time passes, it could end up getting worse.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you very much for your time today, Tom. I'm sure this will help many listeners understand what is a very challenging topic. Thank you.